Channel open. Welcome back to WeeklyTrek, a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions podcast network. I am your host, Alex Perry.
What's today's date? The date.
Today's show is recorded on August 16th, 2019, and is current through the end of Star Trek Discovery Season 2, so beware of spoilers. All right, let's get into the show.
Good day, Voyager, and welcome to A Briefing with Neelix. It's a catchy title, isn't it?
WeeklyTrek is a 30-minute news show covering the biggest stories from the Star Trek franchise. We are in a new golden age of Star Trek. There are 5 television shows at some point in production, possibly more on the way, and enough merchandise to fill the Bajoran wormhole. So stick with me, and I'll help you sort the real facts from a lot of the Dominion propaganda that you'll find online. But I can't do this alone, and my guest this week is Nick Daly, the man, the legend behind the Star Trek Captions Twitter account. Nick, welcome to WeeklyTrek.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex. It's good to be here. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, Nick, I ask my guests this question every week. I want to know something that's got you feeling good about Star Trek at the moment. What's got you moving at warp 10?
I mean, everything. I just all at once. But I mean, if I'm going to narrow it down, I guess, the next step is Picard, getting to Picard. And, I think I'm most excited for it because it's clearly going to be like a very intimate tale. Like, obviously that's why it's like centered on Picard, but at the same time, it's going to wrap up a lot of questions for where things are, right now for a lot of our other friends in the Star Trek family. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh, yes. And it's creeping closer. I mean, it's the middle of August, so we don't know for sure when the show is going to premiere. Maybe January, maybe February, but it's coming and there's no denying it.
Yeah, I think I was listening to you talk about the books that tie into it. I think I'm going to have to pick one of those up to, hold myself over. If it comes out early, if it comes out early enough, something to hold me over until then.
Yes, so we have the Star Trek Picard Countdown comic, which will be starting publishing in November, and then Last Best Hope will be the first Picard tie-in novel that will be published in February by Una McCormick.
Oh, that's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. IDW is just, they've been knocking it out of the park for some years now with these comics. Just, and I'm kind of late to the game on that. I didn't discover them until recently, but I'm kind of just looking back at some of the stories. They're just, it's great. And then what they're doing now, I'm sorry, this actually is one more thing I'm really excited about. The Star Trek, the Year 5 comic book. It's just,
yes,
been getting like crazy reviews, and I'm really happy for those guys because you can tell that the whole team put a lot of work into it. So I'm happy for them.
Well, speaking of books and comics, that actually ties in really well with my pick this week for what I'm feeling good about Star Trek, and I'm actually picking The Enterprise War, the new Star Trek Discovery novel by John Jackson Miller, which I just finally finished this past weekend. This was a lot of fun. It's a novel about Pike and the Enterprise during Star Trek Discovery Season 1. We know in Season 2 that they did not participate in the Klingon War. They were quite far outside of Federation space. And the Enterprise War tells the story of what happens to the ship during that year. And it's this really fun little story that has this really great spotlight on the Pike character, on the number 1 character, on Spock particularly, and also in helping kind of bridge the Pike character from the Jeffrey Hunter portrayal in The Cage to the Anson Mount portrayal in Star Trek Discovery, and also, frankly, to bridge the Spock from Leonard Nimoy in The Cage to Ethan Peck in Star Trek Discovery Season 2 and kind of bring us to the point at which we meet Spock midway through the second season of Discovery. Nick, have you read any of the Discovery books?
No, I haven't, but being involved with this Twitter account has really piqued my interest in the books. I haven't read any Star Trek books ever. I love reading, but I've just never read a Star Trek novel. And hearing you talk about it and a couple people, online has just really got me excited. This one, that might be the first one I pick up because that's a story that I really want to know about. I had, at home, I had a lot of questions about that. Why they wouldn't be involved in the war and what they were doing. And, it must be something important. So, and bridging the gap, as you were talking about, that's exciting.
Yeah, the Discovery novels are actually a really good jumping on point for Star Trek fiction because they are the books that you can read having just seen Star Trek Discovery and you'll get everything. And I would say of all of them, I think my favorite thus far has been The Enterprise War. Particularly because it focuses on characters that, I really enjoyed watching in Star Trek Discovery Season 2. So yeah, if you were thinking about putting your toe in the water, that's the one I'd recommend leading off with.
Yes, I think I'll do that. I think that's a bet. You got it.
Well, with that, let's turn to the week's top stories.
There's a war going on, and I'm a reporter.
So our first story this week is an exciting one. It's one that we've talked a bit about on this show already, but it's finally official. CBS and Viacom are re-merging. Yes, that's right. The Star Trek franchise is being reunited under one corporate banner. Before 2006, Viacom and CBS had been one company. They had split apart in 2006, and Star Trek itself had been split apart as well. Movie Star Trek went with Paramount, televised Star Trek went with CBS. That's part of the reason why we even had the creation of the Kelvin timeline, and the reason why we've not seen any movies that tie into the TV content that we've gotten since that point. But those divisions will come to an end. So CBS and Viacom are remerging under the name Viacom CBS. This process has been kind of underway now for a year, the negotiations over whether to do it, and they finally come to an agreement. There'd been issues around leadership and who was going to lead the combined company. It looks like Viacom's current head, Bob Bakish, will be the CEO of the combined company, and the current head of CBS, Joe Iannelio, will remain in his position as head of the CBS division of the company. And it definitely seems like the combined companies, understand the power of what the reunification of the intellectual property for Star Trek means for the company, because in their first call with investors following the announcement earlier this week, the corporate leaders did bring up the fact that they, were really excited about the fact that Star Trek would be reunified under one company. Now, we don't know much about what this means for Star Trek, and we probably won't know for a really long time. And if I were a betting man, I would say that neither many people at CBS nor at Paramount yet really have a good idea of what this means for the Star Trek franchise. We're at a very early stage in what is potentially a long process. Corporate mergers of this size have to get approval from the Department of Justice. The Fox-Disney merger that just completed earlier this year was a 14-month process from when the merger was announced to when it was completed. So it could be, up to a year, maybe a little longer before the merger officially goes through and the properties are 100% reunited. But this is a very exciting first step. And certainly from the perspective of putting all of the tools back in the options box for Viacom CBS around what to do with Star Trek, they now have the ability to make use of movies, of television, to have crossovers between the two of them. All of those conversations about what movie content were the TV shows allowed to use, what TV content were the movies allowed to use, all of that goes away, even though by the end it seemed like there were not really much of a distinction between those anymore, given that we know that Star Trek Picard is going to be leaning heavily on some of the Star Trek 2009 plot points. But all of that's gone. But this is a very exciting development. Nick, are you feeling good about the reunification of Star Trek under one corporate identity?
Oh, I'm feeling great about it. Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's clearly going to be positive, whatever it is, just having all that together, and it's great. I think it would be. You can do whatever you want. It's just it's wide open. I'm going to go with Trek Core's idea of a Cybok short trek. I want that Cybok short trek. Yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting.
Yes, Cybok is one of those characters that many have theorized has been affected by this split between the two franchises, because obviously the character was not mentioned in Star Trek Discovery Season 2 and only appeared in Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which meant that lots of people kind of had this theory that maybe Cybok was one of those characters that the TV side couldn't use because it was exclusive to one of the movies, and now we can get our Cybok short trek. Trekcore was not only theorizing that, but fan casting Richard Schiff as a good candidate for Cybok short trek, which I actually think is actually a really good idea, because Richard Schiff is a great actor.
Yeah, Richard Schiff is great. Yeah, no, I enjoyed that. I saw that pick. I thought that was some excellent fan casting.
Yeah, and it's much too early for us to kind of say, who's going to continue to lead the Star Trek franchise. Is it going to be CBS that's in the driving seat? Is it going to be Paramount that's in the driving seat? I think it probably speaks pretty well to CBS that they've put a lot of effort and, frankly, money into building building out an infrastructure for Star Trek with the launch of the Global Franchise Group earlier this year. I think that probably sets them up pretty well for themselves being in the driver's seat as far as Star Trek is concerned. But I'm sure all of those decisions are still yet to be made. But if you're worried about what this means for Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Decks, or any of the other shows in development, I think you can probably rest easy. As I say, it's going to be a while before the two companies are formally under one banner and they can make changes. I'm not sure they're going to want to make changes. It seems like televised Star Trek is really successful at the moment, and there's no reason to make any changes. But this is not the kind of thing that's going to have an impact on Star Trek or any kind of noticeable impact within the short term. This is more of a, if we're now in late 2019, we're looking at a late 2020, 2021 play before we really get an idea of what's going on there. But overall, I think this is really positive for the franchise, the ability to kind of pull every lever at their disposal to continue to spark interest in the franchise is no bad thing at all.
Not at all.
So our second story tonight, we have the launch of a new official Star Trek podcast. So this announcement goes all the way back to San Diego Comic-Con. I think I finally managed to cross off all of the San Diego Comic-Con announcements, and this was the last one. It was sort of dropped in at the last minute in between the end of the Lower Decks panel and the Star Trek Picard panel when the world went crazy and we learned about the return of Seven of Nine and Data and Hugh and Riker and Troy to the franchise. So you can understand why this one would have fallen a little further down the priority list, but still very exciting nonetheless. This will be the second official Star Trek podcast after Engage, the official Star Trek podcast that was hosted by Jordan Hoffman that ended last year. This podcast will be named Prime Directive, and it'll be hosted by Tawny Newsome, who, if the name is familiar, is one of the new stars of the Star Trek Lower Decks animated series. The podcast will be filmed in LA, which is, I think, a good thing. Jordan's podcast was great, but it was based in New York, and so it was much more difficult for him to get, actors from the shows onto the podcast. Being in LA gives them much more access to the cast of all of the different shows. And we can expect, according to the press release, that each episode will feature an in-depth personal interview with a notable guest, coverage of a Star Trek event, or a discussion of a specific topic with one or more guests. So it sounds like they're keeping their options pretty wide open in terms of what the podcast itself will be. But I think, great to hear that they are diversifying the brand. More competition in the Star Trek podcast world. There are 1,000 Star Trek podcasts, but I will be listening with great interest to this one, especially because being a CBS product, they have access to information and to guests that, most of us fan-run podcasts will just never in our wildest dreams ever be able to have access to. So it should be a really good show. And Tawny Newsome herself is already a podcast host, and so has a lot of experience with the medium and knows how to put on a good show. And there will also be a second host that will be announced at a later date. But Nick, you're guesting on a Star Trek podcast, so I guess Star Trek podcast must be, part of your listening routine. You're looking forward to adding a new official Star Trek podcast to the docket?
I will. I'm super excited, just the fact that there is an official Star Trek podcast. And I'm also really excited about Tawny being the host because I'm familiar with her work on Comedy Bang Bang and Spontaneation. It's a very difficult one to say. It's a great podcast with Paula Tompkins, and I'm never able to say it. My wife will tell you. But anyways, but Comedy Bang Bang more so is really I love Comedy Bang Bang, and I've been listening to it for years, and she'll come on there and do these spots that just destroy. And so that's great, and then the fact that she's on Lower Decks, that's really exciting. So I'm excited. It's a new voice. I like bringing, a new voice into Star Trek to host this brand new podcast, wherever it leads. It's very exciting.
And now is the right time for a relaunch, because with 5 shows, at some point in production, we've got one on the air already. We've got one that's coming very soon. They're well placed to have lots of content. The previous official Star Trek podcast suffered a little bit because I think it launched about a year too early. Jordan launched it about a year before Discovery even came on. And, between 2016 and 2017, we had the launch of Star Trek Beyond, and that was pretty much it. And they were anticipating that Discovery would premiere much earlier, and so they would have more Discovery content that they could use on the show. But now we have this kind of big engine up and running and humming away, and shows that will be coming year round. So there's plenty of content for this new podcast to explore, but also, a few points in the press release, they made it really clear that they're not just interested in looking forward, but also interested in looking back as well on the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, and the Kelvin timeline. So that's also exciting to see that we'll be getting official content in podcast form that gives us this kind of sweeping whole look at the franchise. I think I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that it's an official podcast, they're going to be able to get great guests. So it's just kind of wide open, I think, for what they can do with that show.
I think they are probably best placed to get Sir Patrick Stewart to guest on a podcast than any of the other Star Trek podcasts that are out there.
Oh man, that would be great. That'd be like through the roof if that happened. That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah,
wow.
Sure would be great.
It's like pie in the sky, Yeah.
So no release date for this one, but when we do get an official release date for it, I'll be sure to let my listeners know, and it will almost certainly be available in exactly the same place that you're listening to this podcast right now. So stay tuned for Prime Directive. Shifting from podcasts to Christmas ornaments. Now that STLV is over, my mind turns towards the next big holiday of the year. That's Christmas. Yes, it may be late August, but I'm a big Christmas freak. And so I am now starting my Christmas countdown. And so what better time for us to talk about Hallmark's Star Trek ornament plans for 2020. This will be the 30th anniversary of the Star Trek Keepsake ornament line, which is really exciting. I mean, they've been doing keepsake ornaments longer than some of the TV shows have been on the air. Star Trek Voyager will also be celebrating an anniversary in 2020, but it will only be their 25th anniversary. So 30 years of Star Trek Keepsake ornaments. There are more than enough now to fill probably an 8-foot tree, and there will be more coming in 2020. And Hallmark will be really stepping up the interactivity of the ornaments that they'll be releasing. So at STLV, Hallmark announced that there will be 4 ornaments that will be released next year, and they will all fall in part of the Star Trek Storytellers Keepsake Ornament series. So what this is, it's a series of ornaments that have both light and sound and that interact with each other. So the ornaments that are forthcoming are Kirk, Sulu, and Uhura from the very famous episode of Star Trek The Original Series, Mirror, Mirror. And each of them is programmed with a number of different lines from the episode. And depending on which combination of the ornaments you have, ornaments will kind of act out scenes from the episode. And then when you add in the final piece, which I know a lot of people will be very excited about, there will finally be a tree topper in the Hallmark ornament line. And yes, it will be the original USS Enterprise Constitution class. It will also have lights and sound, and it will also be part of the Storytellers Keepsake Ornament series. So it will integrate with Kirk, Sulu, and Uhura. There are so many different combinations of sounds and lights, depending on which you have, depending on who speaks first. I was at a Hallmark store once, and they had the Star Wars versions of this, and it was an X-Wing, a TIE fighter, and the Death Star. And I saw them kind of interacting with each other. And, one would light up and would say a line, and then another would light up and say a line, and then the third would light up and say a line. And they were definitely kind of playing off of each other. I think they all kind of plug into one power cord, and that's how you kind of get that kind of sequencing from it. But I mean, it's a pretty cool idea. Assuming this goes for a couple of years, you've got 9 or 10 of these sitting on your tree, and they all kind of are talking to each other and basically more or less recreating large portions of Mirror Mirror, which I think is really fun. Those will be the only releases in the Star Trek Hallmark line for 2020, but they're pretty big releases. I mean, to finally get a tree topper is a huge one. Nick, have you got any Hallmark Christmas ornaments?
I did in the past. I don't think I have it now, but I had the Enterprise D at one point.
Very cool. The second release in the line.
Yeah. It was a while back. Was that like back in the maybe back in the 90s? I'm not sure.
That was the second year they were releasing them, so that was probably 1990.
Okay.
If we're at 30 years It's 1989, so that would have been 1990 that came out.
Yeah, no, that adds up now because I remember my dad being super excited about it. That's funny. Yeah, it's hilarious. Vague memory, but yeah, it's funny. But I remember that. I remember the ornament. Like I remember having it. I remember seeing it on the tree, and I wasn't sure how long it had been exactly. But that's funny.
The fun thing about those ones was you could plug them into the light string on the tree. So they were basically, when the lights for the tree came on, the lights in the ornament came on as well. I have a bunch of those older ones that I still have a light string that you can kind of pop out the lights for and pop in the ornament cord. And it is really nice to have them kind of light up with the tree itself. Actually, the very first one I owned was a gift from my wife. She got me the very same Enterprise D, and I treasure it as well.
Wow. Oh, that's brilliant. That's wonderful. That's great.
Yes, but being a bit of a collector / hoarder, I haven't got them all, but I probably have let's just say I have more than there is room for on a tree, given that I'm not allowed to have 100% dedicated Star Trek tree every year.
Yeah. You got to, compromise is important.
That's right. Compromise is important to any happy relationship.
Yeah.
So our last story this week is that Anthony Rapp is the latest star from the Star Trek franchise to join the Star Trek Online video game. This was announced at STLV that Star Trek Online will have a new storyline expansion coming soon called Awakening, in which players in the 25th century storyline in Star Trek Online will be interacting with a sentient hologram of Paul Stamets from USS Discovery to solve a mystery involving the mycelial network. It also includes the addition of a ship that appeared in the IDW Discovery Annual that was released earlier this year on the Stamets-Culber relationship, which is the USS Somerville. And Anthony Rapp, of course, will be lending his vocal talents to being Paul Stamets, which is fun because if you follow Anthony on social media, you know that he himself is a big gamer. So I'm sure he is thrilled to be in not just a Star Trek video game, but in probably at this point, I would venture to say the most successful Star Trek video game that has ever been produced, given the amount of time that Star Trek Online has been going. Nick, as I understand it, you are a bit of a player of Star Trek Online. Are you looking forward to the Paul Stamets storyline?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to a good bit. It's funny because I played a little bit of Star Trek some time ago, and then I just kind of like dropped out of it, but I came back with this new, Discovery content, and like there's a lot of it, and I haven't worked through it. And my problem is that I take long breaks, and so like I'll forget how to play. It'll take me a second to figure out how to get into the space combat again and everything. But it's really enjoyable when I am in the groove and playing it, and I'm just excited to have Anthony Rapp. I know he's going to deliver some. His dialogue is going to be great. The content that I was playing had Mary Wiseman, as Tilly, and she brought a lot of life to the game, just through the way she delivered the dialogue. It was just that classic Tilly, wit that that you enjoy, from Discovery. So seeing the same from Anthony Rapp being Stamets is going to be exciting. I think that'll be fun. I'll definitely play it.
Well, and it's also fun that they're finding interesting ways of building the Discovery characters into the video game so that you get that really nice crossover of, we are probably less than a year, but we're, probably still 9-10 months away from seeing Discovery back on our screens and spending any time with this character. So, it's actually really nice that, you get the opportunity to interact with the character a little bit in some other form, in this case being a video game. And I guess it's a good year for Paul Stamets because in addition to being added to the Star Trek Online game, the next novel in the Star Trek Discovery novel line will be one that also focuses on Stamets. So Stamets fans have a lot of content to look forward to before Discovery Season 3, it seems.
It's exciting. It's good to hear. I'm excited. I really am. I'm not at all an expert when it comes to Star Trek Online. I'm very casual, but the Discovery story, they added a tutorial to it that made it easier for someone like me who's very unfamiliar with it to get into it. So, I'll be doing the same with the Stamets one when that comes out.
All right. Well, with that, let's get to the fun part.
You make some very good points, Captain. But it's still all speculation and theory.
So we've talked about the facts, and now we will speculate on what's going to happen in the future of Star Trek. So this is the wish theory section of the show. So Nick, give me your wish or theory for the future of the Star Trek franchise.
My wish is to see LeVar Burton return as Geordi LaForge on the Star Trek Picard series for just like one scene. Just one scene, that's all. Just asking for one scene. But, you know, if we're having all these people come back, you know, I've been just a fan of Mr. Burton since I was a kid, watching Reading Rainbow, you know, just grew up with him. So, and then Star Trek, you know, like when Star Trek came out, you know, I was around 7. I mean, when TNG came out, I was like 7. And I already grew up with LeVar as, you know, Reading Rainbow. And, you know, I was like, wow, the guy from Reading Rainbow is on Star Trek, you know, and just so, you know, if we're bringing people back, that would just be a special one. So that's kind of like my ultimate wish right now.
So what do you think? Married to Leia Brahms and stops by the vineyard in Le Bar for a quick conversation with Jean-Luc?
Yeah, that would be great. You know, yeah, absolutely. And you know, with maybe some kids and whatnot. You know, just find out that he kind of settled down and has his whole life outside of Starfleet.
Or how about the alternate future LaForge from Timeless, who's captain of the USS Challenger? That'd be a different direction to go in. But yeah, I think I'd love to see LaForge again. I'd love to see all of the characters at some point, just to, you know, have little scenes to kind of get a sense of what they're doing now. So that's a great wish. I'm right there with you.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's gonna. We'll see. You know. We'll see what happens. You know, we'll see what the future holds.
So my wish for this week is that CBS and Paramount make a very good use of the 12 months that are ahead as the two companies are looking for regulatory approval for the merger to become Viacom CBS. And that's to take their time on figuring out a path forward for Star Trek movies and for figuring out, you know, what are the best kind of Star Trek movies to have in production that are going to continue to rejuvenate the franchise and also help push new fans towards the televised content. And actually, you know, that doesn't necessarily have to be Star Trek movies that are spun off of any particular TV show. I think, you know, the power of Star Trek 2009 and the Kelvin timeline was that they did provide very easy jumping on points for new fans, because you weren't going in with, you know, 30, 40 years worth of baggage and things you had to know about and shows you had to be up on in order to understand the story of the movie. And as a result, you know, we have this whole new generation of fans who, you know, became fans as a result of Star Trek 2009. And so, you know, I think it would behoove CBS to look, and Paramount to look very, very carefully at, you know, what are the components that make a good Star Trek movie? What are the components that make a successful Star Trek movie? Because I think those are slightly different than the components that make a successful Star Trek TV show. And think with a big canvas and paint with a broad brush, and don't be afraid to, you know, kind of try things, because, you know, Star Trek movies are great, but ultimately they, you know, some of them are really good and a bunch of them are not. And ultimately Star Trek's home is on television. And so I think the thinking should be, how do the movies kind of help encourage people to get to the TV shows? And that doesn't necessarily automatically mean putting TV show characters on the big screen. It could be taking other characters, telling broader stories, telling simpler stories, telling stories that are not kind of laden with so much, you know, canon and continuity, but introducing people to the ideas and the themes and the messages of the franchise, so that they're then encouraged to go out and find, you know, other content and sort of get themselves wrapped up in the TV side. So, you know, it might even sound like I'm arguing for continuing the Kelvin timeline or some version of the Kelvin timeline while we have prime timeline on television, and that actually might be exactly what I'm recommending, because I think, you know, those movies did do a good job of bringing new fans into the franchise. It didn't kind of make things difficult for new viewers. It actually made things quite simple. And then, you know, many of them migrated from that. You know, they started out watching Star Trek 2009, and then they want to check out The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise and all of the content that's come since then. So, you know, I'm sure there will be many, many minds whose jobs it will be to try and figure out what the path forward is for these. But my wish is that they, think very carefully about how movies fit into that overall tapestry. And that may not mean a Captain Pike movie or a Discovery movie or a Lower Decks movie or a Picard movie. It might mean something, totally separate from that. And the reason I've been thinking about this is I read a Hollywood Reporter editorial that made this really convincing case about why Star Trek movies shouldn't be based off of the TV shows, that they should continue to do their own thing. And I think I was convinced by it, at least for this week. What do you think about that, Nick? If you were the head of Viacom CBS, what are the kind of movies that you would make?
I want to speak to your idea of having something that's not completely, boggled down by continuity. That's really fascinating. And to that, I love Kelvin, and I think continuing Kelvin is great. But as far as I had this idea of, in the same universe as what's going on in TV right now, Discovery and Picard, et cetera. But you could go out and have a movie of just a completely different crew somewhere in Starfleet that in some year that you've never heard about, and make a whole compelling 2-hour tale about some adventure that they go on, and then just kind of leave them there. But then later on, maybe they show up and kind of the actors from that movie filter into the TV universe, and you create a whole new but it's like a good jumping on point for people because they get connected to these new folks and see them then bring them over to the television side as well. So that's tremendous. That's really outside of the box.
It doesn't have to be Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and it doesn't have to be Burnham, Stamets, and Saru. It could be an entirely new crew, get some bankable names to play the characters and have them kind of do stories that are sort of connected to the Star Trek universe but aren't necessarily, they could be part of the prime timeline or they could be separate from that, but to tell Star Trek stories but do it in a way that is instantly accessible to new fans as sort of a honestly a gateway drug, right, to the rest of the franchise.
Yeah, absolutely. If I was gonna pick someone to maybe it's funny you're talking about bringing in star power and all that, and I was just thinking about we should get maybe they could entice somehow now Dwayne Johnson to come back to Star Trek. I don't know that he did the turn on Voyager and whatnot, but just come back as a completely different character and lead like the captain of a ship or whatever, or even do some, a different play on it where he's not the captain and he's kind of one of the underneath guys, kind of, in the middle of the pecking order, but somehow becomes the hero or what, I don't know, but that I think, his drawing power would be kind of interesting to pair again with Star Trek.
You've heard it here first, people. Star Trek Sunkatse, in which the Pendari fighter is now a washed up old wrestler who has and Marissa Tomei plays his girlfriend and has to deal with not being a success.
And she's begging him, just don't jump off the top rope, just don't do it. He's like, right. I gotta do it, man.
That's right.
I gotta do it.
I am describing the plot of The Wrestler.
It's a great movie, man.
It's a great movie. Yeah. All right. Do you have a theory or a wish for Discovery or the future of the franchise that you'd like to share? Tweet them to me at WeeklyTrek, and I might feature your theory in a future episode. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode of Weekly Trek. Thank you so much to my guest, Nick Daly, for joining me today. Nick, how can people contact you if they want to continue the conversation?
Oh, man, thank you very much. First, I just want to thank you again for having me. This is a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. And I just want to say you can catch me on Twitter at Trek Captions, and I'll see you there.
And it is a fun follow. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
And you can find this show on Twitter at WeeklyTrek and me at Alexander T. Perry. And if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice. And please check out some of the other great shows on the Tricorder Transmissions. And if you like our shows, please also consider becoming a Patreon of Tricorder, which you can find at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. And lastly, if you're looking for Star Trek news on the internet, I hope you will turn to trekcore.com. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you to all of my listeners. And until next week, live long and prosper.